Do you solemnly swear that in the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
In the summer of 1987, Americans witnessed an unusual spectacle, the Iran-Contra hearings. The Reagan administration had been dealing with terrorists. It secretly sold weapons to Iran, hoping that would buy freedom for American hostages. Congress was not informed, as required by law.
I will tell you right now, Counsel, and all the members here gathered, that I misled the Congress.
Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a member of the National Security Council staff, was at the heart of the scandal. He devised the scheme to overcharge Iran for the weapons and divert the excess profits to Contra rebels in Nicaragua.
I don't think it was wrong. I think it was a neat idea.
Neat or not, it was illegal. Still, Colonel North captured the imaginations of many Americans. He received tens of thousands of telegrams of support. It could be awkward to challenge this man who espoused a patriotic, almost religious devotion to his cause. But some in Congress spoke out, none more eloquently than the junior senator from Maine.
The rule of law is critical in our society. It's the great equalizer, because in America, everybody is equal before the law. We must never allow the end to justify the means where the law is concerned. Of all the qualities which the American people find compelling about you, none is more impressive than your obvious deep devotion to this country. Please remember that others share that devotion, and recognize that it is possible for an American to disagree with you on aid to the Contras and still love God and still love this country just as much as you do. Although he's regularly asked to do so, God does not take sides in American politics. And in America, disagreement with the policies of the government is not evidence of lack of patriotism. Indeed, it's the very fact that Americans can criticize their government openly and without fear of reprisal that is the essence of our freedom, and that will keep us free.
For most Americans, this was their first exposure to George Mitchell. But Mainers were not surprised at his calm, reasoned approach to an emotionally charged subject. Maine has sent many remarkable leaders to Washington. Over the past few decades, Maine's representatives and senators have won the respect and admiration of some of the most jaded Washington insiders. But though their accomplishments are many, only George Mitchell has risen to the pinnacle of power in the United States Senate. He worked with some powerful friends, crossed swords with some formidable foes. And George Mitchell's is the quintessential American story. To begin here, literally on the poor side of the tracks in Waterville, and wind up in Washington, shaping policy, making decisions that affect the lives of millions of Americans. And he did it largely by never forgetting where he came from. I'm Pat Callahan. Join me as we follow George Mitchell from Waterville to Washington.
I used to slide down this hill. I broke my leg sliding down this hill when I was 4. Right down here is where my father's house was. There was a street at the bottom of this hill, and the tenement houses packed on both sides.
George Mitchell's family lived in a neighborhood known as Head of Falls, a slum, really, on the banks of what was then a filthy Kennebec River.
This used to be a full paper mill with saws running all the time, so you don't hear it now, but there was a tremendous whine of sawing the pulp logs coming across the river.
That was round the clock?
Yeah, oh yeah, round the clock, with a strong smell of sulfur coming back then, and then the trains rumbling by quite regularly. So it really seems like you're out in the country to stand here now. At the time, it was really a very busy, crowded, noisy place, but a great place. A lot of warm, large families and large friendships.
Mitchell's mother, Mary, worked across the river at the Wyandotte Mill. She had come to America from Lebanon at age 18. His father was born Joseph Kilroy, the orphaned son of Irish immigrants. Joseph spent his earliest years in a Catholic orphanage in Boston.
Back in those days, the nuns in the orphanage used to take the children out on weekends to the Catholic churches in Maine and New Hampshire and western Massachusetts. And at the end of each Mass, the children would be lined up in front of the altar rail, and anyone who wanted to adopt a child would do so. That's how my father was adopted in 1904 when he was 4 years old by a Maine family, and ended up here in Waterville.
When George was 6, the family moved away from Head of Falls to a house just across the tracks. A big step up, symbolically at least, though it was actually a lot closer to the frequent, noisy trains.
I mowed that lawn hundreds of times, I want you to know.
As the fourth of 5 children and the youngest of 4 boys, George worked hard to be noticed.
My 3 brothers were great athletes, still very well known in this area and all around Maine, and I was not much of an athlete, and I developed quite an inferiority complex, but my father, while encouraging them, was very encouraging to me and kept telling me to study hard and work at school, and someday he said, "You'll be as successful as your brothers." I just couldn't see it at the time, but it turned out all right.
George's brothers recall that their father was encouraging, but more interested in education than athletics.
If you didn't do well in school, and that didn't mean you didn't pass, I mean if you didn't do well when he expected you and he knew you could do well, you just weren't going to play. Didn't make any difference to him what sport it was. If you could get an A and you got a C, you had a lot of problems with my father, far more than you did with the school.
George's father gave him his first training in public speaking when George was an altar boy at St. Joseph's Maronite Parish. In those days, the altar boys read the epistles.
So on Saturdays, he would make me stand at the back of the house, in the hallway there, where the back door is, and he would sit in the living room in the front of the house. We were several rooms apart, although the doors were open, and I would have to read the epistle loud and clearly enough so that he could understand every word.
It's clear that in school and otherwise, the work ethic in the Mitchell family was strong.
That we would work. From the earliest days, I delivered newspapers, washed cars, shoveled snow, mowed lawns, worked as a janitor in several buildings in town. That's one of the things that my parents taught all of us, that you can succeed in life, but you have to work hard to do it.
A family crisis when he was in high school helped shape George Mitchell's political outlook many years later.
To this day, it bothers me when I hear politicians and others have blanket condemnations of the unemployed, as though they're a bunch of bums who don't want to work. I know from my own experience that unemployment can be a cruel and difficult thing. My father desperately wanted to work, and he tried very hard to do so. Had a long, hard year when he couldn't find a job, and it was very difficult for him and our family. But eventually found a job as a janitor at Kobe. Doesn't sound like much, but it saved his life and it saved our family, and it was a great thing for him.
As a boy, George Mitchell loved sports and comic books, but he didn't read any real books other than what he needed to get by in school. That changed when he was a junior at Waterville High. An English teacher named Elvira Whitten called him back after class.
And she picked a book up off her desk and asked me if I would read it and report back to her on it. She made it clear I didn't have to do it. This wasn't an assignment of any kind, but just something she thought I might be interested in. And I wanted to do it because I so respected and admired her and knew it would please her. So I went home that night and read the entire book that night. I remember it as though it were yesterday. The book is called The Moon is Down. It's a novel by John Steinbeck about a wartime military occupation based, I believe, on the Nazi occupation of Norway during the Second World War. It's a short novel. I don't think it's much more than 100, 150 pages. So I read it in one night, stayed up late that night doing it, and was very excited to go back and tell her the next day about it. And she smiled, and we talked a little bit more, and she handed me another book. And I read that, and it went on that way for several months. I read several books. I started reading a book or two a week. And then after several months, one day she said to me, after I gave her my latest book report, she said, I think it's time for you to stop picking out your own books. And for me, it was the first sense of self-worth that I'd ever had, really my first step to adulthood.
It was Elvira Whitten's influence that led Senator Mitchell to spend so much time visiting every high school in Maine at least once, asking young people about their hopes and aspirations and bringing them a message.
There's no shame in failure. The shame is in not trying.
And Mrs. Whitten taught him an enduring lesson.
Presidents are important and senators are important, but teachers are very important too. They have an amazing, a wonderful power to expand young lives and improve young minds, and I often wonder what would have happened to me had Elvira Whitten not taken an interest in me.
Mitchell started thinking about becoming a teacher, but those plans would soon change. The work ethic taught by his parents served George Mitchell well when he attended Bowdoin College because the family simply couldn't afford it. He was a proctor in his dormitory to pay for his room, a steward in a fraternity to pay for meals, and he worked 2 full-time jobs in the summer, including landscaping work at Colby College.
Work at 2 jobs. So from 11 o'clock at night till 7 in the morning, I worked in the paper mill in Winslow. Then at 7 in the morning, I'd come up here and worked on construction until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And this is what I did that summer. I built this terrace lawn.
Nicely done, too.
It's a very good job, but boy, it was hard work.
While Mitchell studied at Bowdoin, his father was still working as a janitor at rival Colby.
When I graduated from Bowdoin, I was waiting to go into the service, and I was subject to call-up on 2 weeks' notice. And so I couldn't get a permanent job, so my father got me a job on the ground crew at Colby. And he used to go around and laughingly point to me and say to his friends, Colby had reached the state of excellence that you needed a degree from Bowdoin to get a job on the ground crew at Colby. He really got a kick out of that and used to rib me all the time.
It was while in the Army that Mitchell abandoned his plan to become a history teacher and decided to go to law school. He chose Georgetown University, going to school at night, working by day as an insurance adjuster. A degree from Knight Law School didn't carry much prestige, so Mitchell couldn't get hired at any Maine law firms. While working at the Justice Department, Mitchell got the call from Senator Ed Muskie's office that would start him on the path to politics.
I had not had any previous interest in politics other than as a citizen who followed the news and voted. But I went up and interviewed, and they offered me the job, and I took it on condition that I would plan to leave after the next election because I still wanted to get back to Maine to practice law.
Mitchell became Senator Muskie's legislative assistant, doing research, tracking bills on the floor of the Senate, and advising Muskie. The job and the exposure to Muskie sparked new interests for Mitchell.
Muskie can do more for Maine in the U.S. Senate.
We cannot afford to...
He's a great man. For me, he's really a hero and a mentor. Most of what I learned about politics and government came through my association with him.
Now that's the way that you bring change in an ordered society.
Contacts developed through his work in Washington helped Mitchell land a job with a Portland law firm, but he was never far from politics. In 1966, Mitchell was chairman of the Maine Democratic Party. By 1968, he was Democratic National Committee man for Maine and showing his partisan flair at the state convention.
But this year, their platform makes it plain that the Republican Party is more concerned with politics than it is with progress. It's so full of general platitudes that about all you can get out of the Republican platform is that they favor motherhood, the American flag, apple pie, and the Executive Council.
It was at that convention that Mitchell pushed Ed Muskie as a favorite son presidential candidate, a move that helped get Muskie on the ticket as Hubert Humphrey's vice presidential nominee. Mitchell took a leave of absence from his law firm and organized Muskie's ultimately unsuccessful campaign. He did the same thing in 1971 and 72 when Muskie was making his bid for president. It was quite a political education, especially coming up against the dirty tricks pulled by the Richard Nixon campaign, the phony letters and campaign materials meant to sabotage Muskie.
What most impressed me about Senator Muskie is that he wasn't bitter about it. It was easy for him to have become bitter because the Republicans conducted really a very dirty campaign against him. But I also learned from him the importance of integrity in politics, that you have to stand for something. You have to act upon your convictions, that you can't always do what seems to be the popular thing at the time, but that ultimately if you explained yourself and you applied reason to the problems, people would come to accept it even if they didn't agree with you. And so it's basically a trust in the judgment of Maine people that I learned from him.
Now, George Mitchell was ready to set out on his own.
She gets hungry.
October 1974. Entertainment's main event is Frank Sinatra, broadcast live from a modified boxing ring at Madison Square Garden. Maine's main event was in the political arena, the race for governor. In this corner, Democratic nominee George Mitchell. In the other corner, Republican Jim Irwin. But the other corners were filled, too, by independent candidates, most notably insurance man James Longley.
Help me help the government of Maine.
It was, in a sense, an unusual year because Watergate was still very much in a lot of people's minds. The Arab oil embargo, oil crisis was another piece of business that I think a lot of people felt very hopeless. They had no control over those kinds of dramatic changes.
Former News Center reporter Bill Yates recalls that through most of the summer and fall, the race seemed to be George Mitchell's to lose.
There were jokes in the press corps at the time of Governor Mitchell that it was almost a foregone conclusion that he would win. And I don't really think we, as reporters at the time, anticipated the depth of voter frustration or appreciated the level of organization that Jim Longley brought to the effort.
In which really went unchallenged. Nobody thought he had any chance, and so neither the press nor the other candidates scrutinized his proposals in any serious way, as they did those of myself and Jim Irwin.
Longley painted Mitchell and Irwin as insider politicians and fashioned himself the candidate of the common people. And surprisingly, Longley won the endorsement of the state's largest daily newspaper.
Candidly, and I've said it's the Bangor Daily News, obviously they're a great newspaper. There isn't a greater newspaper in the country, having endorsed us, of course. But beside that, seriously, we've said repeatedly to the pollsters, the equating of the independent candidacy is not being done properly by the pollsters.
Despite polls showing him ahead days before the election, Mitchell was nervous.
There is usually an undecided weeks before the election, even several days before the election. It could mean two things. It could mean that voters are not paying attention, or it could mean that people are taking as much time as they have available to them to make up their minds. If it's the latter, why, of course, that's a healthy thing.
The duties incumbent on me
As governor of the state of Maine.
as governor of the state of Maine.
But when their minds were made up, Longley was governor. Mitchell was second.
It's a little bit like coaching or playing, except that when you're coaching, you have other games coming up. In politics, you lose, you've got 4 or 6 years to wait or whatever it might be. But the next morning, Pat, he thanked everyone and went to work the very next day. I mean, he didn't mull over and weep and gnash and everything. He got up and went to work, and that was it.
He had a lot of inner strength that I don't think any of us anticipated, quite frankly.
At Senator Muskie's request, Mitchell was appointed U.S. Attorney for Maine and then nominated to the federal court seat in Bangor. That lifetime appointment seemed to close the door on politics for good, but for another twist of fate.
Senator Muskie brings to the senior position in a president's cabinet, years of experience in foreign policy, a very deep and profound knowledge of our country.
At the height of the Iranian hostage crisis, President Jimmy Carter named Ed Muskie his Secretary of State. It was up to Governor Joe Brennan to choose Muskie's replacement.
I say this in an attempt, in a sense, to squelch so-called reliable sources' rumors. It gets a little awkward when I wake up in the morning and I read the paper and I find that somebody is going to be appointed or some decision has been made. Well, first, I honestly felt a deep responsibility to get the very ablest person, because I was going to make a decision for a 2.5-year appointment that's usually made by 600,000 Mainers.
Two unfortunate words.
Likely prospects included former Senator Bill Hathaway, former Governor Ken Curtis, maybe Speaker of the House John Martin, or even State Senator Jerry Conley.
And when he was all through, he was clearly undecided. He hadn't made a choice and seemed puzzled and wondered if there was anybody else. And it's only in that context. I wasn't there trying to sell George, because George had not indicated, George had not spoken to anybody about it, any interest he had in it.
And I asked him whether he was interested in the U.S. Senate seat. I called him, and he said he was. And once he said he was, I knew in my own mind that is where I was going.
Mitchell had been a judge less than a year, but he enjoyed the position, and he said it was not easy to hang up his judge's robes to go to the Senate.
So it's mixed feelings, regret at leaving, enthusiasm about taking on a new task.
So the notion of leaving what was a lifetime appointment, a position which I enjoyed, to go into what then appeared to be a very high-risk position and have to move to Washington was a difficult one for me. I weighed it very carefully before making the decision to leave the judgeship and take the Senate.
I'm going to be one of a team.
Despite his ties to Ed Muskie, Mitchell promised to be his own man.
I do not intend to call Senator Muskie up before I vote and ask him how he thinks I should vote. I'm going to do the best I can according to the abilities I have, then I'll let other people make a judgment on whether that's effective or not.
Mitchell had his Senate seat, but would he be able to keep it?
Mrs. Roussis, you play cribbage?
No, I don't know how to play.
You don't know the game?
I know how to cook.
You know how to what?
Cook.
You know how to cook?
Yeah.
He was born and raised in Maine, in Waterville.
When he was appointed to serve out the remainder of Ed Muskie's Senate term, George Mitchell had an extraordinary opportunity for some on-the-job training. He had 2.5 years to show Mainers he was up to the task of succeeding a giant of the political world.
As our senator, he has already achieved an exceptional record. He is George Mitchell, the senator for Maine and the nation.
I recognized when I took office that having been appointed, I had not come through a campaign and therefore was not directly and personally in touch with the views and concerns of people, the kind of thing that you get when you go through a campaign. And that's one of the reasons why I undertook and resolved when I first went in that I would be active, that I would travel the state.
Mitchell began the 1982 campaign as an underdog, 36 points down in one poll.
Just this morning outside a shopping center, a woman told me to drop dead.
Maine's 2 Republican members of Congress were eager to challenge this seemingly easy mark. Olympia Snowe deferred to 1st District Congressman David Emery. Several issues shaped the race. The economy was in deep recession, and President Reagan and the Republicans were taking the blame. There was also the matter of a freeze on nuclear weapons. Many Maine towns had passed resolutions voicing support for the nuclear freeze. It failed in the U.S. House by 1 vote.
The freeze, in my opinion, will just simply lock us in where we've been with disadvantages that pose some very complex problems for our military and for our allies.
My opponent is opposed to the freeze. He is the only member of the House of Representatives from New England to have voted against the freeze in the House. It was a very close result, as you know, and 1 vote could have made the difference. So I think that the people of Maine have a clear choice in that respect, at least in this election.
But the election was also about image. Who looked and sounded and acted like a senator?
He hasn't called his opponent names. He hasn't distorted his opponent's record. He has worked hard to represent us fairly and effectively.
People in Maine had been accustomed to senators who were smart, who had some dignity, who were important in the public debates in the Senate, and he was senatorial. And the guy he was running against was anything but senatorial. And I think that was why he won.
I tried losing, and I have tried winning, and I want to tell you winning is a hell of a lot better.
Mitchell won big, pulling 61% of the vote, erasing any doubts.
I've worked very hard these past couple of years, if I must say so myself. And I want you to know that I'm going to work just as hard for the next 6 years because I want to justify the confidence that you've shown in me, and I want you never to be ashamed or embarrassed at having supported me for this position.
Mitchell did work hard, making an impression on colleagues.
Yes, I figured this fella is one of the smartest I've ever seen, and he's so likable. He gets along very easy, very even-tempered. I've seen him talk strong. Now, Muskie would have righteous indignation. He'd look like he was going to burst. But George, he spoke just as strongly and passionately, but I never have seen him lose his temper.
This action has become necessary to protect the EPA, which is in danger of being rendered totally ineffective by the Reagan administration.
Mitchell carried on Senator Muskie's commitment to environmental issues. At the 1984 Democratic National Convention, it was Mitchell who challenged what he called Ronald Reagan's disastrous environmental record.
He tried to weaken our basic environmental laws. He cut the air quality and water quality programs. He has opposed all efforts to control acid rain. He reduced the EPA to chaos and ineffectiveness.
Mitchell proved to be an effective spokesman for the Democrats. He became the chairman of the 1986 Democratic Senate Campaign Committee. In that role, he traveled the country raising money and support for Democratic candidates.
The Republicans have got the money. They've got President Reagan's personality. We've got the candidates.
At the height of Ronald Reagan's popularity, the Democrats picked up 11 seats and took control of the Senate.
How sweet it is.
The following year, Mitchell joined Maine's other senator, Bill Cohen, on the Iran-Contra Committee. Mitchell was offended by Colonel Oliver North's suggestion that those who disagreed with him were not good, patriotic Americans.
I can recall those events very clearly. The hearings were turning into a disaster, and many of my colleagues spoke to me on the Senate floor as we would break for the hearings and come to a vote and urged me to say something to, in effect, set the record straight. And I did so in a way that many of them found positive.
With his successes and his increasingly high profile, Mitchell was now in a position to fulfill a personal ambition to become majority leader of the United States Senate. He was up against two senators with a lot more seniority, Bennett Johnston of Louisiana and Daniel Inouye of Hawaii. As they entered the old Senate chambers in November 1988 to choose a leader, few expected Mitchell to win, at least not on the first ballot. But in addition to his performance at the Iran-Contra hearings, many Democrats were indebted to Mitchell for his help with their elections in 1986. And ultimately, they believed Mitchell would treat them fairly and be a tough partisan when necessary.
Power changed hands in the Senate today as Democrats elected George Mitchell of Maine, a senator more liberal than many Democrats who voted for him.
I don't think it was an ideological decision or a regional decision. It was simply a decision by a majority that they selected the person they felt best able to do the job.
This is my country.
Mitchell would be doing business with a man who was practically a neighbor, newly elected President George Bush.
Thank you very much. I have all these reporters here, and I want to tell you what I told them, that it is a welcome sign of your good judgment that you have chosen to live in Maine even though you didn't have the good fortune to be born there.
The new majority leader promised that while he was leader of the opposition, he would not be obstructionist.
And we can only have one president at a time. We had an election contest, and Vice President Bush won. And so we want to work with him to deal with these problems. And I don't think that my colleagues want me as majority leader to go out and seek confrontation for the sake of confrontation, to oppose for the sake of opposition. I think it's just the opposite.
Most important to George Mitchell, he would now have the power to set the Senate's agenda, to see the legislation he truly believed in come to the floor.
I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
The Senate Majority Leader is one of the most powerful people in Washington. He schedules the flow of legislation. He is influential in determining who gets coveted committee assignments. And the Majority Leader is recognized to speak whenever he wants. But the job isn't what it once was. Lyndon Johnson is considered the towering Senate Majority Leader of modern times.
Even in the period of the 1950s and 60s, you never got a vote on a matter that you cared about unless the majority leader let you have that vote. The majority leader decided what the votes were going to be on the United States Senate. So that was extraordinary power.
The party structure has broken down, and that's been ongoing since the time of Lyndon Johnson. But I do think that George Mitchell was the first majority leader since then to restore a sense of responsibility and a sense of loyalty within the Democratic ranks. And all the more reason it was difficult, because they didn't have to. He had no club to bring them into line. He had to do it by persuasion, and that's what he's best at.
And people respect him because they understand that when they're called into his office, he'll say, here, we've got 3 options, folks. Here's what we're going to do. George Mitchell is not going to talk about them behind their backs. He is going to keep his word, and he's going to try and get something done. And if he disagrees with you, he's going to let you know about it.
Of course, even George Mitchell can't be good-natured 100% of the time.
Oh, I always try and talk to George sort of Mondays before the whole tempo of the Senate becomes uncontrollable, or late on Friday afternoons when the business is really done. Then you can get in and see him. You try to catch him in between that time, and you see that that George Mitchell frown, the shaking of the head, and that brilliant mind of his working in ways that remind everybody who's in charge.
I think he has a good deal of patience, and at times that patience can be frayed, and occasionally, and I say only occasionally, you'll see it erupt. If he feels that someone is taking really unfair advantage of the institutional process, if he feels that something is said that is uncalled for, or inconsistent with the decorum of the Senate in some flagrant way, then I think you'll see that eruption of temper, and I think it's very effective.
Yeah. How would you assess your relationship with Senator Mitchell?
Very cordial. He balls me out from time to time.
Senator Mitchell's early dealings with the Bush administration were generally positive.
He's a good leader, and he's certainly a good senator for the state of Maine, and he's a man with whom we have differences. But we have a civilized relationship. He'll come down to the White House and he can say, look, I think you're wrong on this. And I'll tell him, wait a minute, I think you're wrong on it. And Chief of Staff remembers one very, very vigorous exchange that we had in the Oval Office just before the Senate got out. But if he walked through the gate down here, I'd say, great, I'm seeing a friend. And that's the way politics ought to be.
The good working relationship between the Democratic Senate and the Bush White House produced a number of important bills, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the package which may be George Mitchell's most enduring legacy, at least in terms of public policy, the Clean Air Act of 1990. Similar legislation had been stymied by President Reagan and by previous Majority Leader Robert Byrd. Mitchell worked tirelessly on arcane details of the bill and on forging compromises to get it passed.
Again, it really showed the Mitchell style, because there were periods of time just before the passage, in the last 6 months before the passage, when even the environmentalists were frustrated that Senator Mitchell was giving in more than they wanted to give him. But what he felt was that you make as large a gain as you can, and you need to essentially get enough votes to pass a piece of legislation. And to be pure and fail made no sense at all. And this was a monumental piece of legislation where the compromises were really on the edges.
After that achievement, relations between Senator Mitchell and President Bush soured. Mitchell opposed U.S. involvement in the Persian Gulf. He helped convince Bush to abandon his no new taxes pledge. Then he led the fight to kill the president's capital gains tax cut. Before the 1992 New Hampshire primary, President Bush blamed a hostile Congress for sabotaging his economic plans.
I will remind you, though, Pat, that for 3 straight years, I have made growth proposals that would have stimulated this economy if I could have gotten it through a highly partisan, Democratic-controlled Congress.
There is no doubt that this majority leader was a tough partisan, but even many Republicans respected that.
I remember, as I've said many times, how President Bush used to say, "I don't understand Senator Mitchell. We had played tennis, or we did this, and we did that, and then he's out beating me up on the tarmac the next day or whatever." I said, well, that's, he's a leader of the loyal opposition, or one of the leaders. And this is very competitive business. Politics is not softball. Some people don't understand it, but he has a job to do. I have a job to do. I think he's done his very well.
Well, I think that George Mitchell is partisan without being obnoxious about it, and I think, quite frankly, with a Republican president in the White House, that's precisely the way he ought to be.
But people who know George Mitchell best, such as old friend Harold Pacious, say Mitchell's partisanship is not for the sake of politics.
While his family was poor, they got opportunity. And he thinks that the Democratic Party is there to ensure that there are no artificial barriers against people, other poor people, rising to fulfill their full potential. He truly believes that, and that's what makes him partisan. He is a partisan for the ideas that he believes in. And I don't think it's simply political party. I think the Democrats best accommodate it.
I certainly don't want to...
In 1992, Democrats recaptured the White House. Bill Clinton and George Mitchell became strong allies. The first year of the Clinton administration was very productive. Mitchell helped the president pass a family leave bill, a national service plan, the North American Free Trade Agreement, a deficit reduction plan, the Brady Bill handgun waiting period, and a reorganized student loan program.
The fact of the matter is, it's been a very good success. And I agree with Senator Dole. There was a good bit of bipartisanship on many important issues, some disagreements. This has been a remarkable session. If we pass health care next year, I say to you that the 103rd Congress will be entitled to use the overused word of historic.
Through his entire Senate career, Mitchell worked to change the nation's health policies.
I feel strongly that every American ought to have the right to good health care, and that every American ought to have health insurance that's permanent, can't be canceled, can't be taken away, and that travels with him or her wherever they go in our society.
Mitchell wanted health care reform to be the crowning achievement of his legislative career. But the Clinton proposals for sweeping change ran up against a brick wall of political opposition. Neither Congress nor the American people were ready to swallow the Clinton prescription. For Mitchell, it was a big disappointment.
We weren't able to do it this year, but I expect it will be done, and that what we did this year will be a building block toward that success.
I've been around Congress longer than I want to admit, and George Mitchell has been talking about health care for the last 10 years. And I thought in many ways that health care was going to be his personal legacy, that he was fighting for something that he truly believed in. Forget about Bill Clinton, talking about George Mitchell. And that in the end, George Mitchell had to make a very important decision, which was, do I want to go for half a loaf? Is it important enough to me to get that half a loaf so I can say that I was a part of it? And I think in the end, George Mitchell finally had to throw up his hands and say, I don't want to pass a bad bill. it's sort of sad that he won't be around here for the second act. And I think that there are a lot of people in the Senate who feel that way.
This is the right time for me to consider other challenges and to give someone else the chance to serve. So I will not be a candidate for re-election.
Senator Mitchell's announcement that he would not seek re-election was a shocker. If there is such a thing as a sure thing for re-election, Mitchell was it. He had won his race in 1988 with 81% of the vote, and his power and popularity had not diminished. But while serving as majority leader is rewarding, it can be very frustrating.
It is very difficult. There are literally dozens of issues and hundreds of people, all of whom I have to consider and keep in mind at any one time.
And there is always some new source of aggravation.
President Clinton had a bill, E-I-E-I-O, and in that bill was lots of pork, E-I-E-I-O.
Yes, it is both frustrating and embarrassing. I think it demeans the institution. I think that kind of tactic is unnecessary, and it's obviously not intended to persuade members of the Senate in debate. It's intended to get attention, to get on national television.
Mitchell's decision to retire from the Senate was disastrous news for Democrats in Washington.
It's not very pleasant to see a grown man cry anytime, especially when it's the president. I begged, I pleaded, I wept. I called him back in the middle of the night. I got him up. I thought maybe he would be in a weakened condition.
Well, there's nobody like him. So in a Congress that is short of leaders to begin with, and a nation hungry for the same, he will be missed.
In the strangest way, he has been the most effective and powerful majority leader since Lyndon Johnson, but in just the opposite mode.
How so?
He listens to you instead of talking at you. He's very much respected, and I don't use this word often, but he's kind of loved in this place, and he'll be missed.
He has set the absolute standard for honesty and integrity and credibility, and I think that the way that he has spoken to the issues has not been matched by anybody in my tenure here.
And it isn't just Democrats who feel that way.
George Mitchell is a very sensitive man, a very caring man. He's firm and he's tough as a partisan. You expect that of a leader. But I've never once in all these many years approached him about anything. He didn't immediately take the time to hear me out and do the very best he could.
He is a tough opponent. He's done a job on us on a number of occasions, but as a person who's worked for New England, there's been nobody better.
He leaves a big hole there because it's very hard to control that place. As I say, it's kind of like losing your favorite babysitter, your nanny, and somebody who really can take the pulse of everybody in that place, figure out what's going to work, and then try and make it all happen.
Not everyone agrees about Mitchell's impact as majority leader. Dave Mason of the conservative Washington think tank, the Heritage Foundation, says Mitchell did just an adequate job.
Well, I think in the sweep of Senate history, George Mitchell is not going to go down as one of the titans of the institution. If you look, for instance, at how he's changed the Senate, the answer is not very much.
Thomas Mann of the liberal Brookings Institute is more positive about Mitchell's policy achievements.
George Mitchell has had an impact on the Democratic Party, on the country, on some public policies, but the Senate is a very difficult institution to change.
Mitchell disagrees strongly with a popular political sentiment in Washington that less government is more. He acknowledges that government cannot solve every problem. But Mitchell believes government has done much to open doors of opportunity, to break down barriers of discrimination, and to create the possibility of upward mobility in America.
No one should be guaranteed success in life. Everyone should be guaranteed a fair chance to succeed. And the only way to do that, in many cases, is by collective action through the medium of government. to create circumstances in which people have a chance. Was it wrong for this country to establish a Social Security system to give elderly people a chance for a few years of dignity in their lives in their declining years? Was it wrong to pass Medicare? The Republicans bitterly opposed Medicare and Social Security, and yet you can't find one today who will say they want to repeal Social Security, Medicare. The same people who regularly denounce the government today support the past actions of the government.
But what are your impressions of Senator Mitchell?
Mitchell's decision to retire from the Senate prompted much speculation about why he was leaving. What would he do next?
You know, either way, whether he goes in the Supreme Court or Commissioner of Baseball, he's going to run into Dal Strawberry. So either way, he's going to get to meet him, so whatever he wants to do.
Senator Dole, if you're elected in '96, would you put George Mitchell on the bench?
Well, I'd get him out of the baseball park, I might, in any event.
In fact, Senator Mitchell turned down a chance to succeed Justice Harry Blackmun on the U.S. Supreme Court so he could focus his energies on trying to pass health care reform. What's most important about the decision to leave the Senate is the desire to spend more time at home.
I began to think about climbing Mount Katahdin 10 years ago, and I really couldn't work it in until last year. And finally I decided, when I was turning 60, I thought, well, God, if I don't do it now when I'm 60, when am I ever going to do it? By the time I get around to it, I won't be able to do it. So I finally went and did it. Just a couple of weeks ago, I went up north into Maine into the woods to hike a trail, a place called Gulf Haggis. It's at the Pleasant River Gorge, which is really a beautiful spot. I'd heard about that about 6 years ago, and for 6 years I've been trying to find a time when I could get to it. Well, one of the benefits of leaving, there'll be many disadvantages, and I acknowledge that, but one of the benefits is if I want to go hike Mount Katahdin or walk the Pleasant River Gorge to Gulf Haggis or do anything else in Maine, I won't have to wait 6 or 10 years to do it. I'll be able to do it in a reasonable time.
Mr. President, if there's no further business to come before the Senate and no other senator is seeking recognition, I now move that the Senate stand adjourned, sine die.
On December 1st, 1994, Majority Leader George Mitchell presided over his final session of the Senate.
The Senate stands in adjournment, sine die.
George Mitchell's life and career have taken many turns that no one could have predicted. But it should come as no surprise that the road that led George Mitchell from Waterville to Washington and around the world always leads him back to Maine.
Jeez, you look great. Look at that suit.
The Mitchell family is very close. Brothers Paul, John, and Robbie, and sister Barbara all live in Waterville. The time they spend together is precious to them.
We really want to thank him for bringing us along on the ride. It's been really wonderful. It really has been. It's been a marvelous experience for everyone in the family. So George, thank you very much.
And the senator is beginning a new life with his bride, Heather McLaughlin. As he moves on, what does he think is the real Mitchell legacy? Ultimately, it is a matter of trust.
I've had, I can't tell you how many times people come up to me in airports, in restaurants, on the street in Maine and say to me, well, Senator, I don't agree with you on a lot of issues, but I voted for you and I will support you because I think you try to think things through and make the best judgment on the issues. And I think that's what people have a right to expect. And good judgment. I think that's an important thing in a representative democracy.